we know from lots of research out there, like kids notice different colors, skin, and things, very, very early, like by the age of 2. And they use those differences and those observations to make decisions about people and their behaviors. And so without having that context, kids will just come up with all kinds of things. And so it's really, I think, important as parents to make sure our kids have the messages that we want and have those positive messages that, like, we have friends of all colors.
Hello and welcome to the Sunshine Parenting Podcast, where each week we talk about ideas for raising kids who become thriving adults. I'm your host, Audrey Monkey. Here on the podcast, I share my experiences raising 5 kids who currently range in age from 16 to 26 and working with thousands more as a summer camp director over the past 3 decades. I'm the author of Happy Campers, and I frequently do workshops with parents, teachers, and summer camp professionals about social skills, connection, and happiness, topics I researched extensively for my master's in psychology. If you want tools for raising kind, optimistic, self-reliant kids who become thriving adults, you've come to the right place. Hey, Sunshine Parenting listeners, welcome to episode 145, which is first being released on Friday, June 26th, 2020. This week's One Simple Thing tip is to make a list of all the things that have not been canceled in 2020. This is a simple gratitude activity that you can do either on your own or as a family. During this time when so much is canceled, it can be really easy to focus on all the things that we're not able to do this summer. But we'll all feel better if we think about and are grateful for the things we can still do. This past week, I had the opportunity to go on a hike with my family outdoors, and I was reminded that being outdoors, being with my family, and enjoying nature have not been canceled. I think you'll really enjoy this week's conversation with Danny and Courtney Tobin. Danny is an experienced camp director who previously worked at Camp Kinneret and now works at RM Pyles. Courtney is an assistant professor in the Department of Community Health Sciences at UCLA. Courtney's areas of interest include psychosocial stress and coping, African Americans, and racial and social economic health disparities. Danny and Courtney recently welcomed their first child, baby Jameson, into the world in May 2020. Danny and Courtney graciously agreed to chat with me about their insights and thoughts about bringing a Black son into the world in 2020. Well, I am really, really happy today to have some brand new guests who haven't been on the podcast before. I have Danny and Courtney Tobin. Welcome.
Hello.
Hi.
So, Danny, we met through the camp industry, and
Yes.
Courtney, we met because you've been involved in the camp industry, but you have a different profession. So, can we just start by having you both introduce yourselves and just tell a little bit about your professional work that you do?
Yeah, so I'll go first. So, I'm Danny. I grew up in summer camp, and I became a year-round assistant director at a camp called Camp Kinneret, and that's how I met Audrey through the camp world. And I've since moved on. I'm the camp director at a camp called Pyles Boys Camp, and that's where I'm at right now.
And, I got introduced to camp through Danny, but I kind of work with the opposite end of the spectrum. I'm a professor at UCLA in the School of Public Health, and I study race and health, primarily focusing on stress and coping and mental health among Black Americans. So kind of some over intertwining topics with camp and wellness, and yeah.
Well, and I was, before we started recording, I was telling you that Danny, you put a note in our camp group list saying, when all of I guess it was a couple weeks ago when things started, just George Floyd and everybody, all the protests and everything, you put a note saying, I'm a Black man, camp director, open to talk to anyone who is interested. And so I reached out to you and said, hey, why don't we chat and you come on the podcast? And then you said, I think my wife would be good. Then I looked her up and I was like, would she ever? So anyway, Courtney, we're going to have some more chats about some other of the things that you're studying, because I think that whole stress and health and how your race impacts that is such an important topic. So we're going to do that in a different episode. But today, first of all, I want to say congratulations. You're brand new parents.
Yes, thank you. Our little boy, Jameson, was born on March 23rd, May 23rd, sorry. So he's 3 weeks old now, and he's definitely been a big joy to us during all of this going on.
That's a good distraction. I mean, a little bit, you don't have time to watch all the news. But so I think, tell me your thoughts. I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic. And there's just a lot going on right now. What were some of your thoughts around, okay, here's our little boy coming into the world? Courtney, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I would definitely say, like you said, in the beginning, it was kind of like a good distraction, but then it's like reality kind of hits between, worrying about COVID and then kind of, everything that's happening with race and racism right now. And here we are bringing in this little brown baby into this crazy world. So, as a new mom, I would definitely say it's definitely been a lot of stressful thinking about kind of like, what did we set you up for? But then also, at the same time, it's just trying to, you look at him and you're like, you have so much hope for not only the world, but for what kind of life he can have. So it's kind of, it's been a mixed bag of emotions for sure.
Oh yeah, it always is. When you have a brand new baby, that's what it's all about.
Yeah.
At least I know as a mom, that's what it was. It was always like the ups and downs, right? Right from the start.
Yes.
But I can't even imagine being in this particular moment in history and having a baby. That is a lot. Good thing you study how to deal with stress appropriately, right?
Yeah. It definitely helps.
Yeah. And Danny, how are you feeling with about being a dad and bringing your beautiful brown baby into the world?
I've been excited to be a dad for a long time, and I've been working with kids since I was in high school. And so I definitely feel like, I was ready for it and excited, for it. Before Jamie was even born, Courtney and I, we knew kind of what we were getting into and what the shape of the world is. And we already knew that we wanted to surround Jameson with a lot of positivity, a lot of resources, so that he can grow up to be a strong person of color, to the point where we love to read. And so we, already started building a huge library of a lot of Black stories and Black authors as well. And it's funny because when I talk to other friends that have, that are white or not of color and they have babies, that's not even on their radar of what they have to be concerned about raising their kids. And so, and then, he was born, on Saturday before Memorial Day when all of this really, kicked off. And so just holding him, as a day old and then watching the news and thinking how surreal this all is. And part of me is like, I can't really pay attention too much to what's going on in the news because I have a baby that I need to care for at the moment. And that is what's, definitely the most important thing. But at the same time, it's what's driving all of us to want to be connected and to want to have these conversations too.
Well, I do think that is a really positive outcome of this, is that we, I was raised in the 70s and 80s, and now I'm, learning all about how the color blindness idea that was that was sort of how I was raised. And that obviously now we know doesn't work because people notice even from a very young age. So I'm hopeful that Jameson is coming into a time that is going to be better, for him. 5 years from now when he goes to school, hopefully we'll be seeing all those books like in every classroom and that kind of thing. So
Mhm.
what are your kind of messages? I'm guessing primarily my listeners are probably white. Mostly. I have some, probably different races as well. But what are some messages that you want to give to people during this time where many of us are feeling pretty overwhelmed with like a lot of information? And I think like how can we best support you and Jameson in like making the changes that we all need to make to make this world a better and safer place for him?
Yeah, I think for me, especially with young kids, it's education, and not shying away from the being able to educate and set up your kids to grow up in a world where they understand the struggles of the world, and they know how to work with it and deal with it. I think there are simple things that you could do. If you're a white person raising kids, you might think about like what you mentioned, the color blindness. Everybody is all the same, and we're all the same, we're all equal, and that's what's important. And we realize that doesn't work, because then now we're diminishing our differences. We're not recognizing that we are different, and we need to be able to coincide in the world with differences as well. And I think for young kids, you could do that in such simple ways. I mean, if you have a little girl who wants a Barbie, like, okay, great, we'll get them that white Barbie, but at the same time, get them that brown Barbie, and kind of create that environment where they are getting used to seeing people of color, that they're playing with colors. When they, at school or in preschool, when they're this young, help them recognize that their fellow classmates, these other kids, might look different from them, and just start having those conversations as opposed to just thinking that, color doesn't exist.
Do you think that even counts to things like talking with little kids about, you have toes that are long and you have toes that are short and you have long hair and you have short hair, and just like all differences? Or do you think it's really just focused on like skin?
I think it can be all differences. I mean, I think it can be like, hey, I noticed that one of your classmates wears glasses and you don't wear glasses. Do you know why they wear glasses? And just like in differences, or like, I noticed, one of your classmates is, has a hearing aid, or has a peanut allergy. From the camp world, I can tell you that there are so many parents who don't want their child to be in a peanut-free environment because because they eat peanut butter, and so they don't want to take that away from their child, rather than teach their child that another child has a peanut allergy, and that's a difference, and they need to be aware of that and be empathetic to that, as opposed to just trying to control the environment that your child is in. So I think it just goes to a lot of different differences, and acceptance as well.
And I think you can definitely build on that, so like starting out with all differences when the kids are really young, I think that's the easiest way to kind of start those conversations, because kids will notice and point out everything. So, I think a lot of parents shy away from pointing out differences, or, say, don't say that, or don't mention that. But, again, like you said, that color blindness or just blindness to differences doesn't really help, especially when they get a little older. And then the conversation does focus around race, because they've never had those conversations before, and we know from lots of research out there, like you mentioned, kids notice different colors, skin, and things, very, very early, like by the age of 2. And they use those differences and those observations to make decisions about people and their behaviors. And so without having a context for understanding that different color skin doesn't mean that one is bad or one is good or things like that, without having that context, kids will just come up with all kinds of things, and 9 times out of 10, it's not necessarily going to be good, and so it's really, I think, important to just, as parents, to make sure our kids have the messages that we want, and have those positive messages that, like, we have friends of all colors, and, we see their colors, and, their family looks different than ours, and they look different, and that's great. And we love to have friends who are different than us, and so I think, really expressing that early can make such a huge difference. And, I think that's really why we see a lot of intolerance or indifference for adults, because they didn't have those kind of conversations as kids.
Yeah, and I think to add on to that too, since kids can recognize, skin color and differences at that such young age, there's, the studies that show that kids will naturally gravitate to the color of their caregivers as well. And being a Black man that I also used to teach transitional kindergarten. So at that young age, and encountered lots of young kids who, might shy away from you or be like, nervous. And, the first thing that usually goes to parents' heads is like, oh, they're just shy around new people. But I can tell you a lot of times they're looking at me because it's the first time they've seen a person of color. So it's not necessarily that they're shy around people, they're shy around me because I look different than what they've seen before.
So if a parent, let's just take that example. So the parent is bringing their child into your class and you're the teacher. What would have been a good way for that parent to, address that?
I think part of it is, I think it's we as society need to do a better job of preparing our kids before like entering that environment. And then it's, having that conversation and maybe it's, outside the classroom, hey, why were you so nervous about, what's going on? And I don't think naturally people are going to be like, it's because, your teacher is Black, because I don't think they also aren't thinking that way. They're like, oh, my child's not racist, or my child, and it's not even about being racist. It's just looking at something that's different and not understanding it. And so I think, not being afraid of, okay, this could be the reason, and being able to address that.
Yeah. And I think it also could help, like what you were mentioning before, Danny, thinking about the role of representation. So I think as Black parents, we think a lot about representation, and we want, Jameson, our son, to see like kids of all colors and brown kids and all this. But I think, having diverse representation is just as, or if not even more important for white kids, because, again, like so many kids have never seen people of color before. And so, you may not be able to change necessarily the composition of your community or your school, but if you've had books or movies that have these positive images, which it's 2020, it's a lot easier to find than I think in years prior. But, I think if folks are really intentional about having that representation for their kids, you might be able to avoid some of those kind of awkward situations, because it's not like a situation where, there's so many examples out there about little preschoolers saying like, why is your skin like that? Or like things like, because they just don't know, or they don't understand that people look different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think the parents need to own that. I mean, one example when I was teaching was one of my 4-year-olds one day looked at me and asked if somebody painted me as a baby. Mm-hmm. And well, it's such an innocent question, and it doesn't come with any, prejudice or racism. It's just an open, curious question, because they were not exposed to that, because the parent never sat them down and specifically talked about differences and how people look different, and people are born with different color skins. This little 4-year-old just was thinking, well, you have brown skin and somebody must have painted you that way.
Okay, so what about parents, like a lot of my parents who are listening, whose kids are older? And maybe they do have some friends with different color skin. Maybe they don't. I don't know. But what do you do now? Like, what do you do if your kids are older, like say junior high, high school, elementary, and you haven't had that conversation? What would be your suggestion? Or I started that conversation in a way. What would you suggest for parents? Like, what could you say at this point if your kid's 10 years old and you haven't really said, hey, we've not talked about this. What are some key points that parents could make?
Well, I would say, especially with the times that we're currently in, and kids are super aware and they know what's on the news, I think using current events as a way to start the conversation is a really great way, because the kids see there's protests, there's all these things happening. And so that could be a good opening to say like, what have you heard about this? Or what do you know? Because kids will surprise you. They may know what's going on and have a better grasp of a lot of the situation better than kids, or better than adults. So I think it will be a good starting point, especially for older kids, for parents to just ask them like, what do you know about, the protests that are going on right now? Have you heard of Black Lives Matter? What do you think about it? And kind of use that to get a sense of where their kids are and start the conversation. And, kids, may want to talk about it and say like, what do you think? Or, would you like to learn more? Kind of things like that. So I think that's a great like starting point to really have a good conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say expose them to a lot of movies and resources and books that you might not necessarily think that they were ready to be exposed to. And like, I have some friends who they have 4 young kids, and they all, as a family, watched the movie Selma together, and that can have some pretty heavy stuff in it. And I know that if things weren't the way they are, they wouldn't choose to sit down together as a family and watch that movie right now and talk about it. But I think not being afraid of those really heavy topics that kids are going to be able to understand. And now if you want to really assess if your child should watch something, maybe watch it beforehand and do your homework that way. Because we do want to protect kids from certain things, but we also want to have real conversations with them and recognize that they can understand and handle a lot more than parents give them credit for. And that most people just have built a bubble of protection that doesn't need to be there.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So true. Well, it's funny because I think actually it's easier when your kids are older. You can really have some good, like, there's a lot of books now, like Just Mercy. I read that when it came out, and then the movie, it's also so good. So even if you don't read the book, and now they have a young adult version of Just Mercy.
Okay.
Which I think is it's pretty short, and it teaches a lot, I think. And then The Hate You Give, which is a novel, of course, but that movie is also, it was really popular too. And a lot of kids saw it, but that's when I think that parents could use that as a way to kind of watch the movie together and then debrief.
Right.
Like, what'd you think about that? That movie, I don't know. Have you seen the movie, The Hate You Give?
No, we haven't seen it, but we've seen like the trailers and stuff like
that. This is the thing. It's crazy because I had read the book several years ago. I've read both of her books, but the movie starts with the dad giving the talk about police, and you put your hands out, and that of course, nobody knew that people were going to be watching it in this particular moment, but it's very relevant to kind of a story. Because, when you get into a story, you can empathize with the people in it. So those are really great suggestions.
Yeah. And I think and also kind of piggyback on the talk is that something that not a lot of people really think about is parents have a lot to worry about, a lot of things that they're going to have to talk to their children about, maybe it's sex education or whatnot, but to really realize that for Black families, before at a very, very young age, we already have to have a conversation with our children, especially Black boys, about how to interact with police officers, and to know that you don't have to have that conversation with your child is definitely a sense of privilege as well.
Yeah, I was talking to a friend who's a person of color, and she was saying that, she's made a lot of efforts her whole life to make everyone comfortable. Going into work settings and just different places, just to make it easy for the white people around her. And that really resonated with me, that just thinking about that and having more empathy for the work, the extra work that parents have to do. Right. It's tough. So I really do. I'm hoping that Jameson will experience something different. Wouldn't it be great if you didn't have to give him the talk? That could be the goal. It's just, he's 0 right now. Come on, people. We can do it. He doesn't even talk yet. So it would be amazing if we could get our world to the point where that talk is no longer necessary, Yeah.
Right.
Well, this has been terrific. I could talk to you guys for hours, but there's probably a baby to be fed or something. And I would really love to have you back on to continue the conversation, as, right now it's very topical. It's kind of funny how the COVID news, I don't know if you noticed that the COVID news dropped off, but the virus is still spreading.
Yeah.
But
even more
exactly.
So now too.
And my husband and I call this the People magazine world. Nobody reads People magazine anymore, but when we were younger, something would be on the cover of People magazine and everyone's talking about it. And then 2 weeks later, it's, no longer, people aren't talking about it, even though it's still going on. So I think the actively being anti-racist needs to not be just like trending for the moment. We need to work to keep it until you don't have to give Jameson the talk, right?
Right. And something that I think is also really important, and this is more maybe on like an education in the school-wide system, is that we focus on it as not being something that happened in the past. Because I know growing up, for me, in my school setting, it was, let's talk about slavery, let's talk about civil rights, all things that happened in the past that don't exist anymore. Well, obviously, it doesn't. They do exist still. And so we need to be constant about that, about it's not just something that happened in the past, but it's, okay, let's now talk about how that has shaped the current events as well.
So true. Well, I know that I have a lot of learning to do. I'm just like, I have this stack of books this big. And I guess since there's no camp this summer, I have time to read them. So send me your recommendations as things come up. And let's stay in touch and keep this conversation going, because it's such an important one. And I feel like, the camp community and the education community working together can really make a difference. Thanks so much for coming on, Danny and Courtney.
Yes, of course. Thank you for having us.
My favorite this week is a website and an app called All Trails. If you're thinking about doing more hiking with your family this summer, All Trails is a great way to find hikes and be able to download maps and get reviews about how difficult different hikes are. As always, you can find notes, links, and other resources related to today's conversation by visiting my website at sunshine-parenting.com. While you're there, be sure to sign up for my email list so that you don't miss out on any of the great resources I have available for raising thriving kids. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd really appreciate you sharing it with a friend. Please take a moment to give Sunshine Parenting a rating or review on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. Let's end with a quote from my book, Happy Campers. Regardless of your child's age, remember that their best practice ground for positive relationships starts with you at home. Siblings, cousins, and close family friends are our kids' first friends, and by coaching our kids through the ups and downs of those relationships, we are helping them gain important social skills that will benefit them throughout their lives. Seeing ourselves as our kids' friendship coaches reminds us that our most important job as parents is modeling and teaching our kids about how to form positive relationships. It is from parents that our children first learn how to connect with others. I'm Audrey Monkey. Thank you for joining me for the Sunshine Parenting Podcast. Join me again next week for more conversations about raising kids who become thriving adults.